Hello world, my name is Mohit Deshpande, and in the previous video which we talked about some of the potential errors that could crop up when you're typing in Java code. Talked about them being runtime errors or compile time errors. But now in this video I really want to get into actually doing things with Java. So we need a unit, we need some kind of structure, something that can store data. And that's exactly what a variable is. If you remember back from math class, a variable is just something like x or y, or in Java's case, it can really be any sort of any sort of identifier within the given constraints, and we use it to store values. Now, Java is what we call a statically typed language, and that means that you have to tell Java the type of variable before you can use it, and it can only be of that particular type. So, I mean, if you've seen other programming languages, some of them might have like the keyword var usually, and that just means a variable of some data type that's so-called dynamically typed, which means given at runtime. But Java has statically typed variables in the sense that you have to say that this variable is a string or this variable is a number, and then it can only be a number or a string. You can't change the type on it like that. Anyway, let's talk about some of the most common data types. Now, I'm not going to go over all of the data types, but I will talk about, the most common ones that we have. So, by far the most common data type is what we call an integer, and we type that by saying int. And this is how we declare variables. You say the name of the type, whether it's int or I'll talk about, long or float, double, boolean, char, and then followed by that is this identifier, and this identifier is just something that programmers use to identify which variable are we talking about. And then of course the terminating semicolon at the end, and if I want I could even assign it a value to begin with. So I'm going to say int x equals 5. Now, int is what we call a 32-bit signed integer. So its minimum value is some really big negative, I believe it's negative 2 to the 31st, and the maximum value of 2 to the 31st minus 1. So, and the reason there's a minus 1 is because one of the bits is used to tell whether it's positive or negative. But anyway, the point is, it's a really big number. I mean, these ranges are pretty big for an integer, and it's by far the most commonly used variable to hold numbers. Now, if you remember from math class, an integer is exactly what we expect an integer to be. It's a number without any decimal places. So 5 is an integer, but 5.234 is not an integer. It's going to throw a little error saying, type mismatch cannot convert from double to int. So integers are only for nice, even, round numbers. Now, in the very rare case that your value exceeds 2 to the 31st minus 1 or is less than 2 to the negative 2 to the 31st, there's what we call a long, and that's a long integer. And instead of being 32 bits, it's actually 64 bits. So now the values are going to go from negative 2 to the 63 power, and the maximum value of 2 to the 63 minus 1. So longs are about twice as big as an integer, but we'll rarely ever see this. I mean, probably the one time where we will see this, let me just type in some value there. Probably one of the only times that we will ever see this is when we're talking about IDs of, like, suppose a database ID, in which case, I mean, databases can have, millions and millions of entries. So that's why we use a long instead of an integer, because we want to make sure that we have enough room that we can store millions and millions of entries. But I really doubt that the things that you're going to do in this course aren't really going to be, that tedious. And just like in it, long is only used for nice, even, whole numbers. You can't have any decimals or fractions. Now, how do I have a decimal or a fraction? Well, we're going to use double. And a double is a 64-bit integer similar to a long, but I can store decimal places. So I can do something like 3.1415, which is pi, and Java's not going to complain at all because I declared z to be of a type double, and doubles also have a really big range, similar to longs in the sense that their range is, a very big range, but they can also store decimal places. And now there is another type called a float, but in almost all cases, we're just going to end up using a double because they're what we call double precision, which means that they're twice the length of a float. Without trying to get too technical here, but in most cases, if you want to represent a decimal, we're just going to use double. So a double is all real numbers. If you're in the thinking in the math context, I can have any sort of number, any sort of fraction, and that's perfectly fine if I'm using a double. Now I want to talk about two other primitive types, and these are all, if I haven't mentioned before, these are called what we call primitive types, which are very built-in, embedded into Java and almost all other programming languages. You'll find these similar kinds of primitive types. So now we need a type for what we call a Boolean, and that's going to be Booleans can store either true or false. They can only store true or false. That's sort of the limit of the Boolean. And you can see where that's going to be pretty useful when we talk about control flow, because we can say, if the light switches on, then, do this. Or if the light switches off, then do this. So Booleans are going to be really helpful in the sense of, control flow or testing, where I have a condition to test, and it can either be true or false. And we're going to talk a little bit more about Booleans when we get into conditional operators. And then finally, we need some way to store, characters or strings. I can have all these numbers, but in the end, I want to print something human readable. And, hexadecimal numbers aren't terribly human readable. So we have a data type we call a char, which is short for character, or I've also heard it pronounced char, but and the reason I pronounce it char is because it's short for character. And I can have this. And a character is exactly what it sounds like, a single character. And note how I use single quotes to denote a character. And if you're curious, it's a 16-bit Unicode character. So I can have C, I can have W, but I can't have multiple characters. That's going to throw an error. I can only have one character. So these are all of the primitive Java data types. And these are all what we call mutable data types, which means that when I have these variables here, I can do any kind of operations I want. In fact, the most important operation would probably be reassigning. So what it means to be mutable is the sense that I have x equal to 5 here, but now I can say x equals 6. And now x is equal to 6, just like that. If I were to have a print line here, and by the way, a shortcut, if you type in sysout and then do control space, that'll expand it to system.out.println. So I print the value of x here, and I print the value of x now. See, we're going to get two different values of x. That's what it means to be a mutable type. In the next video, we're going to talk about what a string is. And essentially, a string is a string of multiple characters, and strings are immutable. This is why I'm talking about it now, because in the next video, we're going to talk about strings, and strings are immutable data types. So anyway, let me run this program, and I have hello world.java sort of in as a primary view, and how I did that was by double-clicking on this tab, and then I can bring the others back. But let me run this. And you'll see x is 5 and then x is 6, and that's what it means to be a mutable type in the sense that we can reassign it. And without getting too technical, the primitives have like their own little space in memory. So you can imagine your computer memory as being a ton of little blocked off cells. So these integers or these longs or these doubles have like a little memory address, and in that memory address are these values, but I don't want to get too technical into the details. But anyway, to recap, these are the primitive types that Java supports. We have an int, which is a a nice round whole number, and it's got some really big range that you don't need to worry about. A long is actually twice that big as an int, and we'll kind of rarely use that. A double is a double precision floating point number, and that basically means that we can have a decimal point now, as opposed to ints and longs where I can't have any decimal points. Doubles can have, fraction, it can be fractions or, any sort of number like that. And then we have two other types that are Boolean, which can either be true or false. You can kind of think of it like a light switch where it's either on or off. And then to represent characters, we have this data type called char, and then we can, in the next video, we're going to talk about strings, where we can put multiple characters together to make a human readable string. So I want to talk all about strings in the next video, and I hope to see you there.